Welcome to the InCamera podcast with me, Alvin Tedjo, the big city podcast about big city issues and big city solutions. Now, when we think of world-class cities like London, New York, or Hong Kong, one of their keys to success is their transit system. The London Underground moves 3.2 million people every single day. Hong Kong's not only moves 4.6 million per day, it brings in billions of dollars of profit every single year. In Toronto and Mississauga, this is something that we don't seem to be getting right. Projects like the Eglinton Crosstown are now in their 15th year of construction and are billions over budget. The Premier is stepping into Toronto, and maybe even here in Mississauga, to remove bike lanes, and yet traffic keeps getting worse. For our first episode of the InCamera podcast, I am excited to bring on Reece Martin, transit YouTuber, advocate, and content creator behind RM Transit. Reece brings a wealth of knowledge from transit systems around the world, knowing what works, doesn't work, and innovative solutions in how we get around. If you haven't yet seen his videos, head to YouTube and check out RM Transit. Now, when I ran for mayor of Mississauga this past year, I wanted to ensure that we presented an inspiring and achievable vision for our transit system. So I asked Reece to be part of the team in developing a plan to get Mississauga moving. What surprised me then, and what we went into detail in today's episode, is that the solutions are not that difficult. Transit riders, like drivers, want fast and reliable service. Throughout the discussion today, we talk about what MiWay gets right, and what we can learn from other Canadian cities, and what Reece thinks about Doug Ford's plan to remove bike lanes in Toronto. Now, if you have any questions or suggestions for the show, feel free to email me at alvin.tedjo@mississauga.ca. And now, my conversation with Reece Martin. Welcome to InCamera, podcast about big city issues, big city challenges, and hopefully their solutions. I'm really excited today to have you here. We've got Reece Martin. You're a YouTuber, content creator who I've followed for the last several years. You've got over 300,000 subscribers, and you love talking about transit and transportation systems. And we've met a couple of times over the years, and really was so excited to get you on here today so that we could talk about transit, not just in Mississauga, but also the region of Peel and the Greater Toronto area. Maybe we can even touch on that new high-speed corridor in Toronto, from Toronto to Quebec City. But I think I just wanted to start with what your interest was in transit transportation systems. What got you in this? What got you to start the channel?
Well, I mean, I think when you're a kid, right, which I was, 15 years ago, you can't get around by car because you can't drive, right? And growing up, I lived in a place that didn't have great transit, and so I just couldn't get around. And when I visited family in places like New York or Toronto, I saw, hey, like the kids here can just like go down to the park, they can go see a movie, it's all easy, they can be independent. And when you don't have transit, you're trapped. And the reality is it's not just kids who can't drive, and it's not just people who can't drive who might want to use transit. And so I think it's really just a useful piece of infrastructure that augments our cities and makes them better for everyone. It gives you an option, right? Like even for people who drive everywhere, what do you do when your car's in the shop and you have to deal with some crappy shuttle or something? Wouldn't you like to be able to just get on a frequent bus and get home easily? And it just makes everything easier, even if you regularly drive. There's so many edge cases where transit's useful.
So what city did you grow up in?
I grew up in Langley, British Columbia, which is kind of like a Mississauga-ish suburb of Vancouver. So worse transit than Mississauga, to be honest.
Okay, so we don't have anything to learn from Langley.
No. Well, I mean, Langley is building a SkyTrain now, so I actually think
that's cool.
I think there is kind of something to learn there. Yeah.
I'd love to talk about elevated transit as well, because I know there's a lot of resistance to that.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Give us a bit of a report card right now where you think Mississauga Transit is.
Mississauga is not terrible, so that's something. I think that it's really interesting in that Mississauga doesn't feel like it has a very structured network. Like you have a couple GO lines that travel through the city. You have like the Lakeshore West line, which has quite a bit of service. You have the Milton line, which is much more limited. And then you have kind of all kinds of random stuff. So you have some good transit coming in from Brampton, some good stuff that comes in from Toronto on Mississauga Transit, so kind of like going to Kipling. You've got the transit way. It feels like a lot of incomplete parts of a network. Like the transit way only goes to Renforth, and then you have to continue along Eglinton just on the street or get on the highway. It doesn't go all the way to Pearson. It doesn't go west through city center. And so it feels like there's a lot of pieces that need to be woven together. But I would say the basics are not too bad. Like when I was walking here, I saw lots of buses going by, and that's good to see. In a lot of American cities, you won't see regular public transit services. So there is actually the basics of a good network here. I just think that you kind of need to take it to the next level.
Yeah, we're kind of at a precipice where we're about to take that next step as a big city with a big real transit system that's interconnected, but we've got a lot of huge gaps. And one of the things we've been talking a lot about at budget, at transit committee, is how we better integrate and how do we advocate for these larger projects, because some of these things we can't do on our own.
Of course.
But we've seen some significant improvements since COVID, which we're really happy about. We've actually seen that we're about, I think, 18% in terms of ridership above where we were before COVID.
Which is amazing.
A lot of places haven't
Yeah.
gone back to that. And we were able to do that because we had to return to service that we had, and then we had to increase service significantly along certain lines. But what's also interesting is that we've seen new patterns emerge as well. So, we approved the Hurontario LRT, 10, 15 years ago, because it was the most frequented bus route. Now, we have Dairy Road in Mississauga, which is just along the north. That's the number one route that we have in the city, and it's actually greater than when we approved the Hurontario LRT. So we're starting to look at these projects in a way of like, how do we get ahead of where we're going to be? Because we know it's going to take so long. What are some of the things that you've seen across Canada that cities like Mississauga can learn? Because it feels like we're, retrofitting a city. There's existing infrastructure there. There's pieces here and there. We're not the city center, right? We're not Toronto. We're not Vancouver. We're not Montreal. But what can cities like Mississauga learn from other cities like it?
Well, I think there's a bunch of stuff. One big thing is setting aside land in advance where possible. So even when you're doing road work and stuff, saying like, if this is going to be a future transit corridor, leave an extra wide median so transit lanes or a transit structure of various types could go down the middle of the road. That helps make it faster to build, and it makes it less expensive. So it can be, a municipal contribution to a bigger transit project in the future. And Calgary has done a lot of that. Ottawa's done some of that as well, where they, even into newly developed areas, they'll leave kind of a really wide grassy patch on the side of the street so you can put in the bus lanes really easily after. But doing that kind of thing when you're doing road work or other infrastructure works really helps make it easier to install transit down the road. And so I think, that's a huge thing. I think being better connected to the city center is huge, because for me, I came from Scarborough today. It's shockingly hard to get here. Like Square One, which is right in city center, is like one of the biggest malls in Canada. On some metrics, it is the biggest mall in Canada. And yet to get here by any way mode but cars, it's way too hard. Like it shouldn't be. There should be at least a frequent direct service to downtown Toronto, because downtown Toronto is a huge global center. And so like by connecting yourself to it, you benefit a lot. And so I think everything around city center and Mississauga as a whole would benefit from better connections into the city, because it would give all those people constantly moving into downtown Toronto the option to come out here and like benefit from some of the unique amenities that exist. And there are unique amenities like Korea Park, for example. There's nothing like that in Toronto at all. Right. And nobody knows it exists because it's too hard to get out here, and so people can't like go and see it. It's beautiful.
So full disclosure, after we met, we talk every once in a while. We text. When I ran for mayor, I reached out to you to sort of help me with the transit plan that we were going to come up with. And I was, I really enjoyed going through that process, because one, it's about city building, and it's about imagining a future transit city for Mississauga. But it's also figuring out where the need is most, right? And one of the things we talked about was making that connection from downtown Mississauga to downtown Toronto, right? And there were some historical challenges too, where we could have been so much further along. And this is a story that the current mayor, the previous mayor, and the mayor before that talked about, how Mississauga could have had a subway. We could have had a subway from Kipling. The provincial government in the 1980s
was open to it.
Actually offered it to then Mayor Hazel McCallion, and they said no. They said, we don't want a subway. We don't want it to go to Square One. And I actually heard one of the reasons was that the owners of Square One were worried that it would drive Mississauga shoppers
away
into Toronto.
Yeah.
And I was like, that seems so short-sighted, because actually I would see it the other way. And it's like, why wouldn't it drive people from Toronto to come into Mississauga?
Well, the thing is, like, Mississauga is, and it will be for a long time, a pretty decentralized place. So by connecting Square One to downtown Toronto, you have this much smaller population, a much larger population. Even if a lot of people here go to downtown Toronto, there's way more people in downtown Toronto to come back, right? And from Union Station in downtown Toronto, there's so many people who can actually kind of converge there and could come to a place like City Center. And so even when there's like an event or something, they could more easily get out here. But right now it's really challenging on transit. And the reality is that we're not adding roads in central parts of the GTHA. Like, the province is talking about highways in peripheral areas, but there's just no space to add roads in central areas. So as we continue to grow, we have to build transit, or we have no additional transportation capacity.
So I know the hope is that maybe whenever the LRT is done, we're going to be at least 2 years past the completion date. It was supposed to be done now, but we've been told it'll be at least a year and a half, 2 years. We'll see how close that is to actually being accurate. But the hope would be that you would be able to take the GO train from where you are, let's say all the way into Port Credit, and then take the LRT around, take the loop. But we need more connectivity than just that.
Yeah.
And also we need to make sure that it's frequent. And without the loop, it actually makes it more difficult, because then you're walking all the way from here and
super long
to
walk,
here. And it's too bad that they took it out and then they put it back in, and that it kind of delays the project. But
sure.
I want to talk about Elevated for a second, because I know that one of the potential solutions would be to either elevate or dig to connect the Milton line through the city center of Mississauga.
Yeah.
And the benefit of Elevated obviously being that it's much more affordable.
Yeah.
Because we don't have to dig and figure out the utilities and moving all of that. Why do you think people are so resistant to that? Because it seems very
I think that people are, in the GTHA in particular, they just think of like New York or Chicago. They think it's going to be like this old-timey thing that's literally from like the 1800s, steel structure, casting huge shadows over the street, really loud because it's literally like a tuning fork. They have this vision of it, and I just insist people should go to Vancouver and look what it's actually like in a modern context, or even look at what sections of the Ontario line are going to be like, sections of the Eglinton line in Toronto. I think people are afraid that it's gonna be negative or whatever, but I think they overrate how much people care about like a elevated structure, and they underrate how valuable transit is. There's another case in Toronto where one of the GO lines got elevated onto a huge structure, and it's much bigger than what a SkyTrain type of thing looks like. And people were up in arms before it got built. There were community meetings, people were screaming and stuff, but they opened it like 2 years ago, and I haven't heard any complaints since they've opened it. I think people are resistant to change. We know that, and they're afraid of because they can see what the negatives would be, but they can't necessarily imagine the positives. And in an urban center like this, having that connection would be so valuable. And it really is, that's the best connection possible, because you could be in downtown Toronto in like 20-25 minutes from here, which would be just game changing. You'd be able to be here faster than you could get to like North York. And so it would totally change around the geography of the region. And it would be, I think that's the type of thing too that really needs to be planned for and protected for. Like somewhere in Square One, they need to say like, these 2 blocks, there needs to be a station here. We need to like protect for it. Like other cities have done similar things where they've said, even if there is a development, they've like left space in the basement to put a giant box where trains could go in the future. That kind of thing. I think it's really important, because Mississauga City Center needs like a good transit connection. And the Hurontario LRT, I see that as local transit. It's better than a bus, but it's not rapid. And so if I think, going downtown Toronto to here via the Hurontario LRT and GO, it's probably going to be like an hour. So it's like twice as long, and you got to transfer, and the vehicles aren't going to be that big, so it could get really crowded over time.
Yeah, versus a spur that would actually go through downtown Mississauga and be part of the Milton line.
Yeah.
I mean, the Milton line is one of those things that people have been talking about forever.
Yeah.
And it seems like one of the challenges is kind of ownership of the line, and how Metrolinx can't, really get the space they need. And so now they're talking about the provincial government saying it's going to cost $6 billion to add another rail line and expand the bridges. The federal government says they're funding it as well, but there doesn't seem to be any progress.
Yeah.
And so talking about system, holes and disparities, South Mississauga served really well with the Lakeshore West line. Really, really well. People in South Mississauga don't want to take the bus. They're very willing to take transit, or take the GO train. And we get trains pretty much every 15 minutes.
Yeah.
But the rest of the city that has to take the Milton line, I mean, we're only talking about a handful of trains going into the city in the morning and back out in the evening. Yesterday, I was trying to get from Brampton to downtown Toronto, and I ended up just driving to Kipling because it was easier to do that. So what do you think some of the biggest challenges are with Milton? And even though it seems like there's political will, there's no real progress.
Well, I mean, I think that it doesn't feel like the city is pushing it enough, because when I look at, I spend a lot of time looking at York Region, because York Region has a lot of transit, and that's something I always compare with Peel Region, is that, Peel is similarly sized, and yet there's like this huge disparity.
More bigger, actually.
Yeah, York has 2 frequent GO lines already, and it has 1 subway line from Toronto, and they're talking and quite seriously working on the 2nd subway connection. They've got the whole Viva system, so there's a lot already that goes to York, and so for Mississauga, you obviously need way more connections. But for York, I see like the mayor of Markham, I think the mayor of Vaughan before, they were like pushing so hard on transit, and we need a subway extension. I mean, like the young subway extension. It's just constant. There's signs in Markham and Richmond Hill about, we need the subway. It's been a discussion endlessly. And I think it's the same with Scarborough. Politicians talk about it in a serious way for long enough, and it sort of just becomes accepted that like we need to do this.
Right.
But I don't hear that so much in we need Mississauga city center needs a better connection, and I think that really needs to be hammered home. For the Milton line, I mean, it's crazy that this is even a discussion, because we're like, $6 billion, and that will get them 2 additional tracks for the Milton line, so the Milton line can run as frequently as you want it to run, basically, if they do that. And it's like $6 billion. The subway to Vaughan or the subway to Richmond Hill, very much a $6 billion things, and this is a way like higher capacity, faster. It's a GO train line. It offers a lot more. It allows you to extend it out further so that you could have frequent service to Milton and all of these other places. And so the bang for buck is huge, and yet I think there's this tepidness around it because there's not the local support that you see in like York.
Which is wild. I mean, I know studies even from a couple of decades ago showed that the Milton line had the highest return on investment for any project in the region, in Peel, which is wild. I mean, even the Hurontario line, we're still so far behind, given that Brampton Council, however many years ago, voted against the extension. Now they're trying to get it. Now they're trying to get it back. So now we're talking about 2 separate extensions. But I wonder if it's, I don't know if there's more of a car culture in Peel region than there is in York region. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it does seem that there's a feeling that transit is, or at least buses aren't as desirable as trains, and people don't see, maybe not the need, but they don't see the potential that we could have if we had more frequency. I kind of want to ask you a little bit about that, because we've talked about, especially when we were coming up with the platform, what could we do right away? Well, we could do rapid transit bus lines, and that would improve service for the people who want to use it. Versus trains, which seems like that would attract more people to do it, but would take billions of dollars more and take a lot more time to build.
For sure.
So I guess what's the balance there? How do we?
I mean, I think that transit, the way I look at it is, there's 2 perspectives that people have. A lot of people who don't use transit regularly think of it as like, this is a sexy investment that's going to make the city look good. I'd take a train, like it seems nice and stuff. When in reality, when you actually use it, and when you're day-to-day commuting or even just traveling around, you realize that, I mean, it's nice if it's on rails, but what really matters is that you don't have to sit and wait for a long time. If you can, go out and get on a bus, and it's a modern bus and it's not super crowded, then it ends up functioning 95% as well as rail, as long as it's not crowded, which it doesn't need to be if it runs frequently. And you can roll that out so much faster. And of course, rail is important, but you don't need rail if the buses aren't full. So you work your way up. And I think getting people to understand this, it's about talking about the fact that when more people take transit, there's less people on the roads. Transit is so much more affordable than driving. And even if you do drive regularly, if you can make some of your trips on transit, you can maybe have one less car in your household. That's great. If you have kids, they can take transit and they can kind of be more independent and get around the city. And when we're talking about the kind of new urban form we're building too, we want to have less parking. We want to have less people driving because it's unhealthy for them. We want them to walk and cycle and take transit. And so I think it's the confluence of all of those factors. It doesn't mean not having roads, but we have the roads. We need the other parts of the transportation network so it's complete, right?
So, and that's what I want to get into next, is around the transportation network, because it seems to be this thing that people don't fully understand. And right now we've run into a provincial government that wants to tear out existing bike lanes in Toronto and even here in Mississauga. And it doesn't seem like they get that transportation is all forms of modalities, right? Yeah. People need to be able to get around in different places, and we need to give them choice. So I tell my neighbors and residents all the time, I'm not trying to force you on your bike. I'm not trying to force you onto a bus. I want to make it so convenient for you that you choose on your own to decide if you want to drive, if you want to take your bike, or if you want to take the bus, or if you want to walk.
Yeah.
Right? So that you have that option. Right now, you don't have that freedom. No. You can only drive in Mississauga. Yeah. And if you can't afford to, then you only have the choice to take the bus. Yeah. The number one reason people choose not to bike is because it's unsafe. We just got an incident report at the city that talked about all the different collisions that we had in the city regarding cyclists and regarding buses. And for cyclists, 87% of all accidents involving cyclists were on non-cycling infrastructure.
Which makes sense.
Which makes sense. So they didn't have bike lanes. They didn't have any separation. They didn't have even the paint, right? They weren't on trails, whatever it was. And that's the number one reason people choose not to, right? They choose not to go. I saw a really interesting measure of the success of a bike lane is if you can see a grandparent, an old person taking it, or a child taking it, right? And so my wife and I talk about this all the time. We want our kids to be independent. They're growing up now. They can go out on their own. But how do we get them to where they go? We end up driving most of the time. But we say, well, I'd love them to be able to take their bike. And we're like, well, do we trust them to take their bike? I'm like, I do trust them. I don't know that I trust drivers.
Yeah.
Right. And we kind of map it out and we're like, well, that route's going to be hard. They got to cross this big street. And so we end up just driving them half the time. So I don't know what else we need to do or how else we can better communicate the fact that these transportation systems are there to give people more options. But also that's the city that we're trying to build. We talk about building way more housing in the GTHA, and we're doing it with lower parking minimums. Yeah. So we're expecting people to travel in completely different ways other than in their cars. How do you think we can do this?
I mean, I think the first thing is that when it comes to cycling, first of all, there's always going to be some people doing it. And so if we don't have the infrastructure, they're just going to, be in dangerous situations, which is terrible. And I think a lot of people, like, even if you don't ride a bike periodically, I'm sure you know someone who does, and don't you want them to be safe and not, risk terrible bodily harm? I mean, the thing is, a lot of it, too, it comes down to drivers just being a bit more considerate and giving people more space. And that's true of drivers to other drivers, too. It's a bit crazy for me in the GTHA whenever I'm on a highway, which isn't that common. The way people drive, it's incredibly aggressive. It's not super safe. People are way over the limit a lot of the time, weaving in and out of traffic. And it's the same. That's dangerous to everyone, not just cyclists, right? So I think we need to have a conversation about safety in general. But I think in terms of giving people options, right, that's what it's about. It's just like having the option to go another way. People talk about, like you're trying to make everything cycle dominated or whatever. And we don't have bike lanes, like proper bike lanes, safe bike lanes that have actual infrastructure, not paint, on 99.9% of roads in the GTHA. And so I think it's a bit audacious to suggest that by asking for 1 or 2% of roads to have a cycle track on them, that this is like asking for bike domination, right? Like I actually think even though the bike mode share overall is not super high, we probably have a lower percentage of roads that actually have cycle tracks, like good cycle tracks, than we have percentage of people riding already. And in places where there are good bike lanes, way more people ride their bikes. It's very obvious, if you make something easy for people to do, they'll do it, right? And the thing is, people talk about the weather in the GTHA, etc. I don't know, it's like mid to late November right now, and it's like a little drizzly outside, but it's just certainly bikeable weather right now.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. I think I want to get into more of the fallacy that bike lanes
Cause
create
congestion?
more traffic.
Yeah.
Right? And the fact that we're actually giving people more options so that we take traffic off the roads.
Yeah.
Right? And that it'll help.
Yeah, well, I mean, fundamentally, right, the number of people that drive isn't fixed. There's not 100 people that decide every day, I must drive down the street, right? People look at what the options are and they make an assessment based on those options, right? People always say, if I had a subway, I would take the subway. And it's like, yeah, and if you had a bike lane, you might not take it, but your neighbors might. A lot of people are pretty happy to get on a bike, and it might turn out that if it's really comfortable and well designed, that a lot more people than you think would be comfortable riding a bike. Like I never really got it, to be honest, before I got on a good bike lane. And once you do, and you realize how quickly you can get around, for kind of medium distances, you're not stopping as constantly as you are in a car. You don't have to wait like you do with transit. And so it can be really compelling for the medium distances that you want to, go around Mississauga City Center or something like that, or get to the GO station.
And that's the really interesting thing here too, is that the data that we have shows that most trips in Mississauga, we're talking about 7, 8, 900,000 trips a day, mostly by car, and that almost half of them are less than 5 kilometers.
Yeah.
So that's a totally bikeable distance.
Yeah. To give people perspective on like a 5K bike ride, it's like 15 minutes on a bike going at like a decent pace. If you're really conservative, like maybe 20 minutes, and you get some fresh air, you get the wind in your face, and you don't have to pay for gas. You don't have to worry about parking. It's really nice. I think people, a lot of those trips, as you say, they're totally practical to be done on bike, and some of them can already be done on bike.
So we've added this new micromobility program in Mississauga this year. We've got 900 e-scooters and e-bikes across the city. Other cities have done this, obviously, already as well. I always thought of it as a bit of a last mile solution, so that it could supplement the transit system and help people get around. And what we saw so far in the first 6 months of the program, we've had about 110,000 trips. And the average ride is about 3.5 kilometers.
Yeah.
So you're seeing people are using it just to kind of get to the other side of their neighborhood, or just to go grab something, get some groceries or whatever it is, or maybe get to the bus, because we see a lot of them sort of around our transit hubs. This is further extending the idea that we're creating a transit network to give people those options
For sure.
that they need here in the city. But I guess what else can we be looking at in terms of supporting that transit network?
Well, just to finish up on cycling, I mean, one big thing is, I think, secure parking. Like if you actually have a bike and you bike around, and I do a fair amount, you realize that in a lot of places there aren't great places to lock up your bike, right? And if you spend, a couple $100s on a bike, or potentially more, as a lot of people do, you don't really want to like lock it up and have it stolen, right? People are going crazy about car theft right now, and it's true that cars cost a lot more than bikes, generally speaking. But it's the same thing. You don't really want your mode of transportation stolen from you, and so I think we need to get better about having good bike parking at places like shopping centers and stuff. Even just having like not a super fancy thing, but just like a locked up area, that's convenient, that isn't, in the parkade or something. I think that could really help make it more convenient for people, not just, single poles, but something a bit more sophisticated. And I also think, expanding something like Bike Share Toronto. I'm a big advocate of more regional cooperation in the GTHA. I think it's something that really limits us, as we don't have more, interconnection, because when you're in Eastern Mississauga, you might as well be in Western Toronto. They're effectively the same places, and we have all these arbitrary lines. And so I think that having programs like Bike Share Toronto expand out into the other cities would be super valuable. I think that's one of the things that I find that makes cycling so compelling. For Bike Share Toronto, you can get a year-long membership for unlimited rides for like $100.
Yeah.
So it's like a monthly transit pass, and you can just take a bike whenever you want. And in Toronto, where there's a lot of stations, it's awesome. You see a bike, you're like, okay, swipe your card, take the bike, ride to your next station, drop it off. It's really easy and convenient. And so I think expanding that option to more places would be great as well.
Yeah, I remember hearing that I think 600,000 bike share rides were taken in the first year of the program, and now they're at 6 million.
Yeah, and what's amazing is that in the numbers they were getting in summer just a couple of years ago, there's now more trips in winter than there used to be in summer a couple of years ago. And I think that really highlights that, like most of the time, and unfortunately maybe more of the time now, the GTHA is like not the harshest climate. It's certainly not Ottawa or Montreal.
Oh, and there's lots of other climates in Northern Europe that have much worse.
I mean, it's no different than walking, right? You're not going to go out in shorts in winter, and you're not going to bike in shorts.
Yeah, you'll just dress up and you'll be prepared for it.
Yeah.
I love diving into sort of transportation YouTube, and I don't want to sort of talk about one of your competitors, but Not Just Bikes they show a lot of the sort of parkades that they've created for cycling infrastructure, which is amazing. And you actually kind of bike down
right
into it.
Yeah.
You bike right in, you park your bike, it's safe, and it's right connected to their major transit stations. So it's that last mile.
Having something like that at Square One would be awesome. And I'm sure that there's going to be a first place in Canada that builds something like that, and it would really put the place on the map. Like, it doesn't have to be gigantic, but being able to bike right into it, you need staff, but you need like maybe 1 or 2 people who can watch like 1,000 bikes or something, and just monitor things. It would be a huge asset for a city, and I think it just gives people options, right? That's what all of this is about. Like, when people have options, driving can get better as well. And not just in terms of like there's less congestion because not everyone is forced onto the same limited road space, but also, if people are thinking about driving and they have all these good alternative options, driving has to be better for people to still choose to drive. And so you actually have this elevation of all modes of transportation. I think a lot of people, they go to Europe and they're like, wow, the roads here are really, well maintained. They're in great condition and everything. And it's because not everyone needs to constantly use them. And so they're able to be in a better condition.
I've seen that quote where it talks about how the sign of a successful city is not where poor people take transit, it's when rich people take transit because it's the better mode of transportation.
Absolutely,
and it takes decades of investment, right, and constant upgrading. One of the other benefits people like to talk about in terms of transit and cycling is, the environmental benefits as well. I kind of want to dive into that a little bit more because there's been a discussion around how we get there, right? And that, an EV is still a car on the road. So, you're doing better for the environment, but you're still not helping congestion. And then what's the right move in terms of buses? Because there's a lot of buses now that are EV or hybrid. In Mississauga, we're converting as many as we can. Almost half the fleet is hybrid now, which is better. But we haven't made the jump to EV yet, just complete EV. We are doing a pilot on hydrogen. We got some pushback on that. But I thought that was interesting because hydrogen, I think, was an interesting idea in the sense that it could be replacing existing sort of internal combustion engine type of infrastructure. Yeah. Right. And so maybe that makes it easier. But, there seems to be a kind of a fight. It feels like VHS versus beta. Where are we in terms of that?
Well, I think that the most important thing, and I think it's lost in this conversation, is, as you say, it's more about car versus transit, right? Because even a bus running on diesel, it's not going to compete with an EV if it's on a fully green grid that's all renewables. It gets harder there. But compared to a regular car, a diesel bus, not even a hybrid diesel bus, is just so much better because ultimately it's about how much emissions is each person generating. And you can just move so many more people on a bus, right? And so already buses are great for transit. And I think scaling transit is more important for emissions reduction than making the existing vehicles zero emissions because If you have 2% or 10% of people riding transit, those people can have zero emissions, and it won't have the same impact as if like 30 or 40 or 50% are riding transit,
Right,
and
if
there's
you're
like low
increasing
emissions.
turnout.
Yeah. So I think that's a big factor that gets forgotten, especially because if the electric vehicles are more expensive, you might be better off just buying 2 less expensive conventional vehicles and moving to electric when it becomes more cost effective, and then just running more service with it. Now, in terms of what the best zero emissions option is, I am a hydrogen skeptic, and the reason I say that is because hydrogen has been around for a long time. Like, California, the perennial innovator and or at least experimenter in all kinds of weird types of vehicles and stuff. They've had hydrogen cars since like Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor, and it never really took off. And the issue was because you don't have hydrogen distribution infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit better for buses because you have bus garages, and so you could kind of centralize that. But it is quite complex because the hydrogen needs to be super cooled. It needs to be stored at super high pressure. It's quite complicated. And so, I'm skeptical. And to be honest, not far from where I grew up in Whistler, where they had the 2010 Olympics, they actually had a whole hydrogen bus fleet for the Olympics way back in like 2009, 2010.
Right.
And they actually abandoned it because they had to pay so much money to ship the hydrogen into Whistler, and also the buses are more expensive than even battery buses now. So I think I'm supportive of experimenting, and there are experiments going on, and like honestly, hydrogen fuel cells are being tested in lots of cities. Like Tokyo has them, London has them, but they all have more battery buses. And so I think batteries are probably the future. But I think the really interesting technology is battery trolley buses. And so those are buses that use overhead wires to charge. Right. And so what you could imagine is, if Hurontario didn't have an LRT, is you would have some wires up on the main street, like Hurontario, and when a bus goes on the street, it's got a battery on it as well, but the arm just pops up, it charges as it's driving along, and then when it branches off to one of the other routes, the arms drop down and it's fully charged, and it can go do its route. It has lots of battery, and it comes back, and you have these. You still build wires, but you only need to do these central cores of the system. So like
it doesn't
you
have
could
to be everywhere.
Yeah,
like a streetcar.
You could think of like the transit way. You'd wire that up, and then there's all these different routes that kind of converge on it, and they'd all be able to charge in this one location while they're moving. So you don't have to, because that's a big problem they have, is that if you have to stop the vehicle to charge it, then the vehicle isn't in service. You're not providing service. And so I think the TTC has found that each electric bus it has, it's able to put out a lot less service with it because they've chosen to go with the like stationary charging, not even at like the transit centers, but like in the garages.
Right.
And so it means that each vehicle can just go like, I don't know, only 60% as many kilometers a day as a diesel bus could. And we don't want that to be the case because we want to change to electric. I think talking about some of those solutions like hybrid wire buses would be really interesting. And in Europe, they're doing a ton of that stuff.
We've been talking a lot about that, and the challenge of having those EVs is essentially we need 50% more so that they can service the routes when the buses are getting charged. We met with another group that was doing kind of an induction charging from underneath, but again, they have to be stopped at either a station or somewhere else, not in the garage, but they were talking about charging 5 minutes at a time every hour. At sort of longer stops. So that's interesting. But one of the points that you made, I want to touch on a bit more because it was really important to talk about frequency, right? And that the best service is one that comes more frequently. It comes all the time. And so, a bus that comes every 4 minutes is better than a train that comes every 15.
For sure.
And that's kind of where we've started investing here in Mississauga, is that last year we actually increased service about 8%. And that was the most we could do. We actually only passed 4 initially, and then we did a top-up halfway through the year. And now we're going into next year saying we want to do another 8 because of capacity, right? We need to get more buses. We need to get more drivers. But that's led us to have that increase in service and get more riders because we had a lot of incidents in previous years where we had full buses. And I think that's even worse.
Of course.
Because now you have people who want to take transit who suddenly said, oh, this service isn't that great.
Yeah.
How many buses need to drive by me before I can get on?
No, it's super crappy.
And I think that's a challenge that they've had in Toronto for decades, but like the Young Line when it gets to Bloor, and it's just that bottleneck, right? And so now we're trying to get more buses on the routes that we know have that that huge demand and just continuing to funnel that to get more frequency. So we're lowering the number of our routes to every 20 minutes, every 50 minutes, every 10 minutes. And hopefully we'll get, the LRT up and running, and it could actually run right now every 8 minutes. But if they did the loop, it could cut it in half, which I find an interesting thing. So with that challenge that we've seen with the Hurontario LRT taking an extra couple of years, with the Eglinton LRT, because I'd love to talk about the Eglinton LRT expanding into Mississauga, maybe taking over the Transitway or just along Eglinton, have it continue along Eglinton. We got a lot of population along Eglinton.
Yeah.
But we're talking about a plan that hasn't finished the original phase.
Yeah.
They're already working on the expansion. There is a second expansion that's supposed to get them up to the airport. And then now I'm trying to get the conversation to talk about a third one into Mississauga.
Yeah.
It's been 14 years since the first one.
Yeah.
What do you think is behind the challenges that we face here in Ontario? It seems unique almost here that it takes us so long to get something built and it costs so much more money.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you look at Eglinton in particular, right, you had Metrolinx at the time had never done a serious project. So I think that's a huge factor, right, is that there was a huge inexperience. And taking on what is a pretty big project, right, with so little experience meant that I think there were a lot of mistakes made. There were a lot of kind of places where they flew a little too close to the sun, like when they were going under the subway, they thought it was going to be better conditions, it was worse, and that really made things more complicated because you had the 50-year-old young subway and it's like not in great condition, and they're trying to build something underneath it, so they gotta fix the young subway at the same time. And so I think part of it is not being super prepared. And then part of it is making decisions in the way things are planned that bring on more risk. Like we were talking about elevated versus underground. There are other places on Eglinton where they didn't have to go underground. It was a choice, there's less disruption or whatever. And I think a lot of the time these negotiations are a bit silly in hindsight, because we should kind of demand now that if something's underground, it needs to be just lined with density, because to justify that cost, you need to have a huge amount of housing and other developments, right? And so now I think we need to be in a place where we say, if a community that isn't going to have a ton of densification wants rapid transit, it's got to go above ground, because we just can't afford as a region to build all of that stuff deep underground when it's not going to be surrounded by a lot of homes and stuff. And so I think that's a huge factor, is choosing to be deep underground and choosing bigger stations than were necessary and kind of overbuilding in certain places. That's a huge factor. I think not necessarily being super coordinated and prepared, right? So you think about things weren't protected for, right? Like we knew we were going to be building an Eglinton subway for a long time. They were going to build one in the 80s or 70s or 90s, and they didn't. But we knew we were going to build one at one point. So they're doing all this utility work to move utilities. And what a smarter region would do is say, well, we're going to have a subway under Eglinton. Maybe we shouldn't put utilities right where we would put the subway under Eglinton, so we don't have to relocate them all.
At a huge cost.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So it's not shooting yourself in the foot. It's just planning ahead a bit. Like I said way earlier, we don't do enough of that. Now, if you look at some of the more recent projects Metrolinx is working on, they're way too expensive, and they are also too slow, but they are better than Eglinton. Like, we're going to go from 14 years to maybe 7 or 8 years for more complicated projects. And so they're getting better. But yeah, we need to make some decisions about the speed. And I think part of the problem too is there's a huge cost to being late, but there's not an equivalent positive reaction to being early. And so what that incentivizes for projects and for an agency like Metrolinx is to pad the schedule, to always add extra time, because you don't want to be late. You never want to risk that. And what that leads to, as anyone who's been in school ever knows, is if you give yourself too much time, then you can just procrastinate and things can move slower than they would otherwise. You need the pressure to keep you focused and to keep things moving quickly. And so I think that's why you're seeing some of the newer projects are moving a bit faster, is for their faults, the Ford government's like, we need the Ontario line. And so they're focused on it, and it is moving more quickly because the pressure is on. Right. I think we sometimes allow these things to take longer because we're like, oh, well, it's going to be good when it comes. And I think that's a problem. So we need to be a bit more rational in our conversations about these things.
I saw some content recently that talked about how the downtown relief line, which is essentially now the Ontario line, has been talked about since they put in the first line.
Yeah.
Right. And talking about forecasting and sort of having that idea that we are going to build transit here, seems like something we've lost over the last several decades.
For sure.
Learning about the Bloor line 2, and how the Bloor Viaduct over the Don River, which was built in the 1910s, that they had the foresight 40 years before they built the subway to build the rail bridge underneath. Like, that's wild to me that in the 1910s they said, you know what, one day we might build a subway here.
Yeah, but that's what we really need to go back to doing that, because, the costs are not, it's really the same thing with the utilities. You look at the Ontario line. We definitely knew we were going to put a subway under Queen Street, but it's the same utility problems. And so it's being buried halfway to the Earth's core because there's all this stuff under the ground. And it's like, okay, in the past 50 years, we should have slowly been moving that stuff out of the way every time we were doing road work, so that when we finally built it, it was much easier. And so it's about being thoughtful, because that's not that expensive. To not do something is easy, as long as you remember to not do it. And I think that's the problem, is we're not looking at a long-term plan and saying, when we do this road work, we're going to kind of move things around like this, and we're going to prep this, and we're going to buy land up here when this is available. We just need to have more foresight. We can't be, flailing around with different plans and stuff all the time.
It needs to stay on top of the political agenda.
For sure.
Right? That we need leaders who are always going to be constantly saying we need to constantly improve and expand transit options and transportation options moving forward. So just as we're about to wrap up here, it does seem like it is the right time that more people are talking about transit options. There have been more investments. We've, sort of stalled on some of the execution, but is there something now that sort of gives you hope that we're going in the right direction and that we're going to get these things done?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the GTHA is building more transit than any other city in the Western world, right? Like, we've got 3 different subway extensions, one of which is getting to the edge of Mississauga, right? So it's getting closer. GO is getting expanded, not as quickly as it should be, not for the prices it should be, but it is getting expanded. And already, if you look at the GO website these last few weeks, I've been seeing there's a lot of delays because of heavy use. Like, people are getting on the trains, and the system is getting better, and we're providing more options. You can pay with your phone now for Presto, like across the region. There's fare integration. Like, a lot of positive stuff is happening. For me, it's frustrating because I always see it as like it feels like it's always 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Like, we did fare integration, but it was like, oh, we could have tweaked it and made it even better. But ultimately, we are making a lot of progress, like more progress than almost any other city on the continent. Definitely more than any other city on the continent. And so I think there's an attitude that, like, transit is here. We need to make sure that we don't build all this stuff and then just go on the brakes again and wait another 30 years to build stuff. We need to at least say, what are the next projects we're working on? What comes next? What are the policy changes we want to make? Even if there isn't huge capital budgets to build subways like there has been under the Ford government, which there might not be because we're spending so much on that stuff. There's so much low-hanging fruit in terms of, like, better wayfinding, better fare systems, better mapping, better tech use in transit so that it's easier to track where your bus is, nicer bus stops. Like, there's so many things we can do to make the experience of using transit better, and we're doing a lot of those things. And so I think it's really it's about a sort of continuous improvement, making it a better option for people. As we get more density, transit just looks more and more attractive.
Yeah.
Like, it's actually crazy. I feel bad about this, but I ended up driving with someone into downtown Toronto a few weeks ago, which I hadn't done in literally.
I love how you feel guilty when you don't take transit.
Terrible. I mean, I took transit here and it was a nightmare, but I did. But going downtown Toronto, it was crazy, and there's all these talk about congestion in Toronto. And what I find remarkable is that the subway has all these problems, and nothing is perfect with transit, but transit is so much faster to get into downtown Toronto and get around. Like, even with all of its problems, it's way more consistent. Yeah. You're not pulling your hair out with, like, the stress of traffic, and the whole time you can just be on your phone, right? And so it's already a really compelling option. I think people sometimes need to kind of recalibrate, like, in a lot of cases, transit's already people's best option in Toronto. They just need to, make it the choice they make.
That's true. And you should start checking out our enhanced bus stops. We have some enhanced ones.
That sounds really
that are
cool.
Nice, here in the city, where they're really big. They've got some heaters.
And that's like the vegetables of transit, right? Like it's not this amazing thing, but when you actually are using a bus, it's the thing that you care about. It's just that you're like warm and dry and comfortable while you wait, and you get on your transit, and so things like that, they don't get a lot of credit, but they're like the most important things, right? They're the things you need for everything else to work.
Well, and when you're saying 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that reminds me of so many different things in terms of like the rhetoric around it. Bike lanes was one of them, but even the tunnel that the premier is talking about, the tunnel under the 401, like it just seems crazy. We did a back of the napkin, and it was like $100+ billion.
Yeah, I mean,
you could spend on so many other things.
Well, that's the thing is, I think people they're like debating the possibility. And it's like you can build whatever you want to build, but like the issue is that the 401 is already one of the widest highways in the world, one of the busiest highways in the world. Clearly, it's not working. Clearly, that like just adding more lanes and more space for cars isn't working, and that's obvious because you're just making it more enticing for people to drive instead of looking at, say, hey, this corridor has a lot of potential. There's a lot of destinations along the 401. There's no bus lanes, which is insane. Like there are much more minor highways in the world that have great bus lane systems so that you could have go buses going on and off every couple of minutes. It would make it would probably, double the 401's capacity to just have good transit on it. But we still haven't done that, and we're talking about, not seriously, but we are talking about tunnels underneath it, right? And so I think it's...
The premier seems serious. I mean, we can talk about induced demand, but
we
it
don't
just
have the
seems
money.
Wild to spend that kind of money on just more car infrastructure when you're saying there's so many
and with
other
no
solutions.
Tolls. And that's another thing,
That's
right?
Wild.
Transit riders pay a fare. I think that more often, we should be talking about drivers paying for the roads, and it's fine. It's like you pay and you get a better experience for it, but that it helps offset the cost of the infrastructure.
I know Toronto's not ready for this. New York didn't seem ready for it either.
But they're talking about bringing it back. In New York.
And London introduced a congestion tax, and it made a huge difference in terms of traffic getting into the city. Just talking about that 401 corridor. Just your thoughts on the high-speed rail that the federal government has re-announced. I think after 5 governments have announced in the past. Is this ever going to happen?
I mean, I think it should happen. I think I'm really disappointed with the federal government because I'm happy that they are. I remember, like, I was just getting into transit when the last federal government under Harper was kind of wrapping up, and there was just not much getting built. Like, Vancouver got like 1 transit project in that period of time. And the current government, for their many faults, has at least been consistent about, like, they've brought their 1/3 of funding for big transit projects. And so I think that's really good. But on intercity rail, they've totally dropped the ball. I mean, they were talking about via high-frequency rail, like, right when they got into office. It's been 10 years. They have nothing to show for it.
It's so much worse.
Yeah, it's
Via's
worse.
so much worse
Exactly,
now.
right?
Yeah.
So I think it's something we do need to have. But I'm not convinced that the current government has the vision, and I'm a little worried that we're not getting the execution right. So I think we're in a good place where we're discussing it, but hopefully we're waiting to like pull the trigger until we actually know what we're doing.
Yeah. Okay. For those of you who don't know, Reece Martin, RM Transit, follow him on all platforms.
Essentially, yeah.
But mainly on YouTube, I think is where most of your videos are. But all platforms, you can find him at RM Transit.
Yeah.
This was an incredible conversation. I was really glad you could come out, talk to us about transportation systems today. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me on, Alvin.
Thank you. And that's the end of our episode. Special thanks to Reece Martin for coming down. Really appreciate the time coming down to Mississauga, taking transit as difficult as it was to get here today. Please follow him, like and subscribe to his channels at RM Transit. And please also like, subscribe, and share our podcast here on all your social media and find us where you can find your podcasts. Appreciate your time here today. I'm Alvin Tedjo. Please share your comments at alvintedjo.ca. We'll see you next time.